Uh, to repeat what I just said very, very briefly, since the recording has begun, I'm going to start out by saying a few things about the 2020 elections here in Kansas, and I'm going to suggest some ways in which the results of those elections tell us something about what we need to think about, what we need to think through in order to best understand what took place in the Capitol building nearly 2 weeks ago, the attempted coup there, and what it tells us to think about, what it tells us that we need to work through as we go forward with politics. So my primary point about the 2020 elections, specifically as pertains to Kansas, we talk a great deal about polarization. We hear that discussed in the news media. Political experts like myself make a constant reference to it. Everybody that's involved in any kind of party building or get out the vote efforts, or even just casually interested people that follow candidates and support certain causes, they are also aware of and they think in terms of party polarization. However, it does seem to me that often when we, experts and ordinary citizens alike, talk about polarization, we tend to mostly think about it in terms of the fact that Republican and Democratic legislators, whether in Congress or in the state legislature, don't get along anymore. We talk about it in terms of how the trust that used to exist, or at least the nominal degrees of respect that used to exist that allowed compromise and other sorts of common work to go forward, has declined greatly. And those things are absolutely true. What I think receives less attention is the fact that if we really take seriously the idea that we have seen in American life, for reasons of technology, for reasons of economic change, for reasons of demographic shifts, we could get into any of those topics if you choose, but for lots of different reasons, if we have in fact seen a growing polarization where Republicans are much more unified around a certain set of beliefs as Republicans, and Democrats are much more unified around a certain set of beliefs as Democrats, and there's less compromising, and there's less respect, and there's less understanding between them. What that also means is that there are probably fewer people who change their minds, or fewer people who are undecided. Polarization is not just something that exists within the legislature. It is not just something that exists within political parties. It is not just something that exists within the donors and the primary voters and all of the interest groups that contribute money and energy to the political process. If polarization is a real thing, and I think we all agree that it is, then it probably extends all the way down to the bottom, including low information voters. And I can't say this often enough. When I talk about low information voters, I am not insulting a set of voters. I am using a term that's used in political science to describe voters who are not interested in gaining a large amount of political information. They just have a low level of political information that directs how they operate. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. I am a low information pro football fan. Okay. My decisions about pro football are based on rather minimal information because I'm not interested in getting more information than that. Lots of people feel the same way about politics, but those people can be polarized too. Okay, so all of this might sound very abstract, but let's put some specifics on it. Let's put some meat on the bones. In the 2020 election, Barbara Bollier ran for Senate, and it was the single best campaign a Democrat has run in the state of Kansas for the Senate in decades. All right. You have to go back to the race that Bob Dole won by a whisker to find a Democrat that was willing to challenge an incumbent with the sophistication, with the experience, and most of all, with the money that Barbara Bollier had. Okay. She had a lot of money. She had a lot of money from here in Kansas. She had a lot of money from outside of Kansas. And the whole goal of the Barbara Bollier campaign was very, very clear, and it was very, very sensible. The idea is there are more registered Republicans than Democrats in the state of Kansas. Consequently, if a Democrat is going to win, they have to get Republicans to vote for them. They have to reach out to those Republicans, those low information Republicans. They have to reach out to those people that haven't voted in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 election cycles. Maybe they were registered as Republicans way back in the year 2000 or 1992 or even earlier, but they haven't been voting since then. We're going to reach out to those people. And so they use their money to flood the airwaves, to fill the mailboxes. The goal was to develop a get out the vote operation that would reach as many voters as possible and activate them with a persuasive, moderate message. Well, we all know what the results of that was. On the one hand, the get out the vote efforts on the part of the Barbara Bollier campaign were enormously successful. And frankly, it wasn't just her campaign. Similar campaigns all across the country that had lots of money did a fantastic job with the get out the vote efforts. More people voted in the 2020 elections than have voted in any presidential election in close to a century. This was the highest voter turnout the United States has seen in any of our lifetimes. It was a fantastic operation. But who exactly were the voters that operation discovered? My argument is they discovered a lot of voters who were polarized. In other words, the Barbara Bollier campaign here in Kansas, while extremely effective in reaching out to low information voters all across the spectrum and activating people that had not voted in years, it was really, really a well thought out strategy, except that it was a strategy that assumed that a case could be made to these voters. And maybe it couldn't, because maybe they were already polarized. Maybe they were already Republican.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Where are the independents in this? Because I thought we had about 40% independents in Kansas.
So I'm the wrong person to ask that because I'm one of these boring political science types. And I look at the electoral data and I say there is nothing like 40% of voters in Kansas that fit the definition of an independent. A definition of an independent, as far as voting is concerned, would be a person who votes for one party, one election, then votes for another party, another election, or that splits their vote between Republican candidates and Democratic candidates when they vote, and then splits it in a different way the next time they vote. I mean, people can say they're an independent, but unless we see that evidence of them actually changing their mind in regards to, different electoral inputs, then I'm not sure we can really trust that they are independent thinkers. Again, please don't take this as an attack. I don't think independent voters, to whatever extent they exist, are somehow smarter or wiser or more careful with their votes than a deeply committed Republican or a deeply committed Democrat. There are people who are deeply committed to their parties, and they are smart people. They do their research. They have applied their own sense of judgment, their own opinions, and they have come out as straight ticket voting Democrats or Republicans. I think that there's this easy tendency to assume, oh, if you vote on the basis of the candidate and you change your mind a lot, then that must mean you're, particularly astute. I'm not sure there's actually a whole lot of evidence for that.
And
And
they
in any
declare a
case,
party in the primary anyway.
what's that?
They have to declare a party in the primary anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you want to be a really astute participant in the civic process, then one logical argument is to say, well, then that means you've got to declare a party, because otherwise you're not going to be able to participate in the primary process. And people could argue against that, but my overall point is simply this: I do not think for a moment that 40% of Kansas voters are independent, because I do not know of any evidence that suggests anything like 40-point swings in any votes, all the way down to like county elections in Kansas. Okay. How many independents do we actually have? How many people do we actually have that actually change their minds from one election to another? I would say it's much less than 10%. Okay. Maybe I could be wrong about that. And obviously, things are going to shift as party incentives shift. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. But still, my proposition, and on the basis of the turnout data, I think my proposition is fairly well supported. My proposition is that party polarization has settled all the way down to the low information voters. And so when Barbara Bollier spent millions of dollars to attract voters, she may have actually ended up activating a whole lot of Republicans that actually ended up hurting the party overall in terms of elections to the state legislature and whatnot. And again, this isn't just Kansas. You see this in South Carolina and North Carolina, where hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to try to get Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham out of their Senate seats. And in the end, the results really weren't a whole lot different from what we would have seen if it was another one of these not particularly well-funded candidates that played the sacrificial lamb to give Democrats somebody to vote for. Maybe polarization means that there's just not that many people that you can approach with a message and convince to change their minds. Maybe you just have to motivate the voters that exist. And in the state of Kansas, most of the voters that exist are Republican. It's a Republican state. It's a lot more Republican than Democrat. There are other states that are otherwise. There's a lot more Democrats than Republicans in California. All right. There's probably only a few states where you could genuinely argue that the number of Democrats and the number of Republicans are even enough that tiny less than 10% of voters that actually maybe do change their mind, genuinely matter. These are the swing states that people talk about in regards to presidential elections. And there's fewer of them all the time. I mean, within the lifetime of most of the people listening to me, you remember when Missouri was a swing state, as opposed to pretty consistently red. For a long time, people talked about Colorado as a swing state, but the evidence is pretty clear now that it's pretty blue. Okay, so here's what I want to suggest that the 2020 elections, and the results we hear in Kansas, with a state legislature in the House and the Senate where the Republican Party maintained their supermajorities, where you saw the only Democrat succeeding being the Democrat that everybody was already predicting would succeed on the basis of the voters that we actually know that are there. And that's Sharice Davids in the 3rd district. Everywhere else, it was a Republican result because everywhere else it's Kansas, and Kansas is a pretty Republican state. Okay. So one of my points in talking about polarization is that the party identity and the tendency to align yourself with the party is no longer something that only matters on the level of legislators, or matters on the level of interest groups, or matters on the level of the party faithful. No, maybe it actually matters all the way through the general election to the population as a whole. Now, having said that, how do I connect that to what's going on in Washington, D.C.? So Kansas is a pretty Republican state. Now, you could also argue that Kansas is a very conservative state, and you might be right about that, though there are some interesting challenges to that. And there's a lot of ways you can look in Kansas. There's a lot of ways that you can look in other conservative states like, Oklahoma or others, and you find challenges to that narrative, okay? I'm not saying that political ideology doesn't matter. Obviously, it matters. Conservatism, just like liberalism, just like socialism, just like every set of ideas, motivates people and changes the way they look at the various incentives around them. But if you are not ideological, you might still be polarized alongside a particular party line. If you are polarized along a party line, then that means you're going to vote for that party. And it also means that you're probably going to follow along with that party. Now, this can become very, very sticky when the party goes off the deep end. So let's take a look at the National Republican Party under the leadership of Donald Trump, and let's forget about all of the controversies of the last 4 years. Let's forget about arguments over immigration. Let's forget about arguments over any number of different things that Donald Trump staked out a position on. Let's just talk about the last 2 months. Okay, Donald Trump loses the election. He gets about 7 million fewer votes nationwide than Joe Biden. And those votes are spread out enough across key states that the Electoral College vote clearly goes for Joe Biden. Donald Trump apparently never believed this. And he said that it was false again and 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 again. Now, he is the president of the United States. And the president of the United States also happens to be the leader of their political party. So it's not just the president of the United States saying that the election was a fraud, which it wasn't. It's not just the president of the United States telling delusional lies about stolen ballots and corrupt judges. No, this is the leader of the Republican Party saying that to Republicans. Now, here I'm coming to my point. On January 6th, you had Republicans from the state of Kansas agreeing with the president and voting to contest the Electoral College results. You also had thousands of people mobbing around the Capitol building and hundreds of them breaking in, doing damage, fighting with cops, engaging in acts of violence that end up killing about 5 people. Doing the worst damage to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. that has been done since the War of 1812. And those people who came in because they believed that Donald Trump had had the election stolen from him by fake ballots and corrupt judges. And in that sense, what they were saying is really not a whole lot different from what Senator Roger Marshall and Representative Ron Estes and Representative Jake LaTurner were saying. Okay? Now, I don't actually believe at all that Ron Estes is, some kind of paranoid QAnon believing Trumpist. I don't actually believe that he, in his heart of hearts, believes that the deep state had activated its agents in such a way as to steal the election away from Donald Trump. He might have genuine concerns about, this decision that was made by a state Supreme Court over there in regards to counting absentee ballots. And he might have some other concerns. And of course, when he's going to be asked questions about his vote on January 6th, that's what he's going to say. That's what he's going to emphasize. But in the end, whatever rationale he employed to justify his vote, it followed a line that came from the president, and it's the exact same line that the insurrectionists were following. So now here we are faced with an interesting situation. There's going to be another impeachment trial of Donald Trump, even though he's not even going to be in office at the time this impeachment trial happens. There are possibly going to be efforts to boot people like Josh Hawley and some others out of the Senate for being ringleaders of the effort to challenge these electoral college votes. You are going to see a lot of consequences in the wake of this terrible conclusion to the Trump presidency. And those consequences are going to catch up an awful lot of Republicans. And those are going to be Republicans like Ron Estes who are going to say, look, I was never on board with the violence. I was never on board with, this crazy QAnon conspiracy stuff. I just genuinely wanted to ask these questions. Well, considering the fact that these questions have already been dealt with in state courts all across the country, you have to push him. Why did you ask this question? Well, he asked this question because he's a Republican. That doesn't mean he doesn't think. That doesn't mean he's stupid. That doesn't mean he's mindless. It means that he's polarized in the way that voters all across this country are polarized, in the way that probably more than a few of the people listening to this statement of mine right now are also fairly polarized. There are things that we tend to believe. And because we tend to believe them, we tend to go along with them. We are going to have to deal with, in the coming days, trying to distinguish between, the Republicans that were not actually interested in stopping a legitimate election and the Republicans that were, in fact, interested in stopping a legitimate election. And because they're all in the same polarized pot, it's not going to be super easy to tell them apart, even though there will obviously be a lot of Republicans that will want to distinguish themselves, and maybe very rightly so. But this is the problem, a problem that I do not think that we, and I mean political scientists like myself, I mean everybody, this is a problem that I don't think enough of us have struggled with. Polarization is not just something that exists on the surface. It's not just something that exists on the top. It's not just something that results from all sorts of other murky things that take place underneath it. Polarization maybe goes all the way down. And when you live in a state that is strongly one thing or strongly another thing, then that polarization is going to create a momentum that will carry you along. It carried along 3 of our 4 congressional representatives. It carried along 1 of our senators. In fact, if you think about this, in terms of the extent of polarization, then maybe one of the remarkable things is that Senator Jerry Moran actually didn't go along with it. Given the fact that, There was every party incentive all around him, all of the voters that support him, all of the donors that contribute to his campaign, the state Democratic, the state Republican Party here in Kansas, all of the state leadership. It's actually kind of remarkable that he wasn't swept along with it, because a lot of people are. And a lot of the people who are going to be people who I think are kind of like Ron Estes, a conservative guy, a good Republican, and someone who is willing to say, oh gosh, if the president's tweeting all this stuff, it must mean something. But that doesn't mean I buy into the whole satanic conspiracy of pedophiles stealing electoral college votes. But he showed up at the same place and he kind of did the same things that the people who did believe those things did. And so that's something that I think the 2020 election obliges us to struggle with. If all of our efforts to spend money and all of our efforts to campaign are really giving us just the exact same voters that already exist, then we have to deal with the fact that maybe the paranoid people, the conspiratorial people, the people who believe Donald Trump's lies about the election, they're not just wingnuts. They're Republicans, because the Republicans are polarized and united, just like the Democrats are polarized and united. You can turn back the clock 3.5 years, and you can take a look at what Democrats were saying about Russian influence in the election of Donald Trump. And, there were some people that had some genuine concerns about some things. And then there were other people that were, total believers in the idea that Russian hackers had actually gotten into voting machines and changed ballots. And you can absolutely distinguish between those two groups. And yet they're all Democrats. They were all polarized together and saying a lot of the same things. This is a hard thing for us to struggle with, that polarization makes mainstream really, really extreme and crazy ideas. Because with everybody unified all the way down, it's not that easy to say, well, this is where real republicanism stops and this is where wingnut republicanism begins. It's not that easy to make that claim any longer because the votes don't demonstrate it at all. Okay, that was a lot that I packed into hopefully a coherent presentation. I would be happy to take questions about the presentation. I would also be happy to take questions about pretty much anything else you want to ask. I can stick around for, probably another half hour or 40 minutes, however long you want to go. And I can answer people who wave their hands, or if somebody wants to do this via chat and read the questions out to me, that's fine as well. Okay, hi, Lynn.
Yeah, hey, I have always been amazed that party stalwarts in the Republican Party have defected. George Will, Bill Kristol, and all those guys in the Lincoln Project who used to be Republican strategists, they're all gone. So it seems to me that if a Republican was a thinking person, he'd have to ask that question. Why are these guys that have supported the party and rooted for the party all these years, why did they leave?
Okay, so my argument about that is that, first of all, I don't think that, it's possible that George Will or Bill Kristol or some of these other people may have declared themselves independents. But for the most part, like you're talking about the Lincoln Project, for the most part, I don't think you're looking at people who have stopped being Republicans. These are people that are really double downing on the idea that the existing party infrastructure can be saved, but it can only be saved by capturing the commanding heights, as it were, within the party. You have got to create a new party line that denounces Trump, a party line that separates itself from the crazies. So, I was just saying that, you've seen with polarization, the mainstreaming of extremism, because everybody's thrown together in the same polarized pot. If people like George Will and Bill Kristol and the Lincoln Project, if they can pull this off, if the never Trumpers can pull this off, then that would be evidence against my thesis, right? My argument, however, is that it's going to be very, very difficult for them to do this unless they can somehow, unless they can somehow get enough people in the right positions to be able to take command of the Republican Party, which in a presidential election year means getting a never Trumper as a candidate for the presidency and having them win the nomination. And then that becomes the line that Republicans fall in line behind. I'm not terribly confident that they're going to be able to do that. It's possible they may, but
that's why I don't think they're in the Republican Party. And also, the guy on PBS, David Brooks. I mean, he was the New York Times conservative columnist. No more.
But are they actually forming another political party? Or are they just saying we're washing our hands of the Republican Party?
Well, I don't know that they're forming another party, but I think there's another party that they can vote in. It's not a third party. It's the second party.
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that most of those people did in fact vote for Joe Biden for president.
Yeah.
I would be really curious to know who they voted for governor, for senator, for congressional representative, for county commission. I would be willing to bet that most of them were probably pretty Republican all the way down the line. I could be wrong about that. It would be interesting to find out if they really were double downing on the idea of supporting Democrats to punish Republicans, or whether they're looking to develop some alternative party structure. I don't know. I just my bet, which I cannot prove, is that even if they all voted for Joe Biden for president, I don't think that means that they would have voted for Barbara Bollier over Roger Marshall. Maybe they would have, but I'm not.
They'd have to. They would have had to.
Yeah. All right, looks like we got some questions in the chat. Let me take a look here. How was Stacey Abrams able to turn Georgia blue? A lot of work over years and years of time. A lot of people look at Stacey Abrams, but Stacey Abrams, let's keep in mind, she's a powerful speaker. She's a wonderful organizer. She's an extremely talented and charismatic person. She is also standing on the shoulders of dozens, hundreds of Democratic activists, nearly all of them African American, that have been working with Georgia voters for a long time. So you've got the penetration of these activists into the Black vote in Georgia. The African American vote in Georgia, for all sorts of demographic reasons, already trends Democratic, but that doesn't mean they show up. You've got to get them to show up. Second thing that's going on is Atlanta. Okay, Atlanta has over the last 20 years turned into a megapolis, on the level of Chicago or Dallas-Fort Worth or Miami or Los Angeles, okay? And huge cities attract huge numbers of people that tend to vote Democratic. After the election, I immediately asked some friends of mine, who's going to write the first article comparing Georgia to Illinois? Illinois being a state that, I used to live in Illinois. If you travel through the state, you've got Peoria, you've got Springfield, you've got, a couple of other decent sized cities, but it's mostly agricultural, it's mostly small towns, and it's mostly very conservative. And then it's got Chicago at the top of it, and that turns it completely blue. Georgia, it's not a perfect example because Georgia does actually have a pretty good size set of cities, Savannah and others. The cities that are in many cases majority African American. So that's quite different from Illinois. But broadly speaking, what you're looking at Georgia is a conservative state where a lot of people have worked for a very long time and have finally succeeded in really, really motivating large African American turnout, which becomes, very democratic. And you've got the city of Atlanta, which is filled with all sorts of Democratic voting cosmopolitans. And so that's what turned it blue. It wasn't just Stacey Abrams, though she was hugely responsible for it, but there were a lot of other people that had a hand in it as well. So yeah, there we go. All right, let's see. Could you comment about the polarization within the parties? Both parties have moderate, far, left, right. So I take it that this is a question about something that is talked about a lot. I mean, as I mentioned before, when we discuss polarization, there's usually a big focus on the parties and on the legislatures and how people are voting up on this top level. Within the parties, polarization has resulted in a good deal of party unity. Okay, the Republicans are just a lot more unified than they were in the past. And that means that outliers disappear. Well, the movement of the Republican Party has been in kind of a conservative, libertarian, constitutionalist direction. And that means the Republicans that, maybe some of us remember from, the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, the liberal Republicans, they're not at home in the Republican Party anymore. Okay. Same thing happens on the Democratic side. The Democratic Party has been moving in kind of a more progressive, left-leaning, socialist direction. Certainly not, the way that would make Bernie Sanders happy, but, in a broad direction. You can take a look at Joe Biden's platform. Okay. And Joe Biden's platform is more liberal, if you use that in kind of a progressive leftist sense. His platform is more liberal than Barack Obama's platform was. And Barack Obama's platform was more liberal than Bill Clinton's was. So you've seen this movement to the left, which means that, again, the voters that a lot of us might remember from the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, the conservative Democrats, they're increasingly not at home in the party. Now, there's all sorts of issues that cross each other, that have different levels of valence. I mean, obviously, like a strongly religious Catholic Democrat is going to be bothered by abortion policy a whole lot more than maybe some other type of conservative Democrat. I was trying to come up with another stereotype, but one didn't occur to me. But okay, so here's an example. Here is not a stereotype, a specific example. Let's go back to Kansas. Let's go back to Bollier versus Marshall. Barbara Bollier served in the state legislature for years as a Republican. Okay. She consistently won in her district there in Mission Hills, I believe it was, in the Kansas City area. Even though, as a Republican, she tended to support causes that through the Brownback years were coded as Democrat, not Republican, fighting the governor in terms of income tax cuts, fighting the governor in terms of, the damage that he did to KDOT and the Department of Children and Families. Ultimately, she switches parties. She becomes a Democrat. Why does she do that? She does that not because she thinks it's going to give her more power in the legislature. Of course not. Democrats are in the minority. Why does she switch to the Democratic Party? Because her voters, those voters in Mission Hills, they are becoming Democrats. That's the polarization going all the way down. They're becoming Democrats. Now, some of them maybe are becoming Democrats because they were raised in a religious environment, but maybe they don't really believe that same religion is more any longer. And so all of the religious concerns about abortion or LGBTQ issues don't matter to them. They've changed their minds about it. Or maybe they've become Democrats simply because of life experiences. They have gone through a bout of poverty, and they were really dependent upon state agencies to keep their families fed. And they see cuts to these agencies, and they can't stand that anymore. So they can't support Republicans anymore. They start supporting Democrats. Barbara Bollier switched because the voters switched. Okay. If there are far, far, far fewer conservative Democrats than there used to be, that's because conservative Democratic voters have become Republicans. If there are far, 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 far fewer liberal Republicans in the legislatures across this country, that's because the liberal Republicans, the Mission Hills voters that used to elect the liberal Republicans like Barbara Bollier, became Democrats. They switched to the Democratic Party. They weren't going to vote for Republicans anymore. And so, if you can, there's a lot of variables at work here. There's a lot of consequences to this shift, but the polarization within the parties, the fact that there's more unity within the parties, that the Democratic Party is more unified in a leftward way and the Republican Party is more unified in a rightward way. The most fundamental reason for this, again, there are other reasons, but the most fundamental reason is because that's where the voters have gone. Okay. All right. Another question. What is the best way to educate low information voters to be persuaded to vote differently than they were when they were initially low information voters? Oh my gosh, if I knew the best way to do that, I could make so much money. I don't know. I don't
have newspapers.
I do not know. Look, of course it's not impossible. There's always going to be exceptions. There's always people at the margin. And there's going to be situations where those margins matter. There's going to be situations like, there are those few swing states, those few states where there actually seems to be a close enough division between Republican voters and Democratic voters that less than 10%, that tiny number of people who actually change their minds matter. So yeah, you can find those people. And maybe some of you know some of those people, or maybe some of you are some of those people. But just because you know those people, or just because you are those people, doesn't mean it is obvious what the educational strategy for such people would be. I do not know how to best talk to people who don't have a lot of interest in politics, but know that they hate Democrats. I don't really know the best way to talk to those people to explain to them they shouldn't hate Democrats. As I said before, maybe, it's going to all come down to life experiences. They were raised in a particular church, and then time goes by, and their kids aren't that interested in religion, and plus the pastor sucks, and time goes by, and somehow life gets complicated and other things become important to you, and all of a sudden you're not going to church every Sunday anymore, and now all of a sudden you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, what was that stuff that they were talking to me about, teaching me about same-sex marriage? I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Or maybe it could be you get fired from your job, or or something else happens. There is some life experience which you can then put together in your head differently. And maybe if you have a friend at the time that those life changes come along, that friend might be able to help you put it together in a way that it actually changes your mind. I'm sorry, that's the best that I can do. I don't want to throw in the towel when it comes to the power of persuasion, because again, there's always going to be these margins. There's always the cumulative effect. If one person talks to person A and doesn't convince them, and then another person talks to the person, and another person talks to the person, another person talks to the person, who is to say that the fifth or the sixth or the seventh or the eighth person to talk to them won't be the one that changes their minds? You can't say that that won't happen. So you try anyway, even though I don't know what is the best way to do it. How do you think we got to this point of extreme polarization? We never used to be like this. Okay, one, that's actually not the case. We did used to be like this. It was called the 1850s in the lead up to the Civil War. Okay. But of course, everybody listening to this presentation right now can remember when it wasn't like this. They can remember the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Well, maybe not so much the 90s. By the 90s, we were definitely on the path towards polarization. But, earlier than that, or even further back than that, you can remember situations when parties would explicitly look to promote balanced candidates, moderate candidates. Presidential campaigns would consist of a president that represents this kind of faction, but they would also have a vice president that represented another faction. Somebody that was looking to win the party nomination would want to try to balance things between different factions. The result of all this, and this was really most of the 20th century, the result of all this was that the political parties did a really good job keeping extremes out of the mainstream, because you wouldn't be able to win if you were extreme. Explaining how the change took place involves a lot of different things. It involves changes in campaign finance laws, as the ability of people and corporations to dump large amounts of money into the political process became common. Political parties themselves had comparatively less control, because they had I don't know. I'll say that again in case somebody missed it. Political parties themselves had comparatively less control, because they had fewer resources in comparison to, the millionaires and the billionaires and the corporations. They couldn't exercise the same discipline over the candidates that were going to, campaign and appeal to the voters. So changes in campaign finance laws are a big part of it. Technology is a huge part of it. The fact of the matter is that when we had only 3 networks and everybody was dependent upon those 3 television networks for most of their political information, there was going to be a huge limitation on the types of news stories and the types of coverage that those stations were going to provide, because they were limited. They couldn't be everywhere. They couldn't cover everything. And plus, they had to hold on to viewers. They had to appeal to advertisers. So they were not going to turn themselves into an all conspiracy all the time network. They wouldn't be able to pay their bills doing that. Of course, nowadays, thanks to the internet, thanks to the digitization of all sorts of broadcast technology, thanks to the fact that everybody with a phone is a reporter, thanks to the fact that we have satellite communications that make it instantaneously possible for people to gain all sorts of different perspectives from all around the world at the drop of a hat, all those rules are out the window. And that means that people can, in fact, effectively put themselves out there in polarizing ways and see if it'll work. And a lot of the time it does. So changes in campaign finance laws, changes in technology, changes in the structure of the political parties themselves. You know, the parties as these bodies that tried to moderate between factions for so many years, you know, they got kind of elite. They got kind of insular. And especially when you were talking about matters of race and matters of gender, this meant that they were overwhelmingly, a bunch of white male organizations that didn't give a lot of minority representation. In the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a huge push to change the rules by which parties operated. One of the big fights at the 1968 Democratic Convention, the one in Chicago that resulted in so much violence, one of the big fights there was changing the rules by which delegates were chosen. So with the changing of the rules, all of a sudden the old guard, which were, frankly, just a bunch of white guys that had run the shows for so long, the old guard gets replaced with a new guard, and that new guard brings new blood with them. They bring new ideas with them. At the same time, you're having changes in technology and you're having changes in campaign finance law. So the vacuum that opens up within the political parties, in the 1960s and 1970s gets filled with a bunch of people who start building much more extreme positions within those parties. And so all of a sudden you've got, the 1990s and into the 2000s, where you've got people within the Republican and Democratic Party that are really pushing things in a way that they wouldn't have been able to push it before. Okay, so there I've given you 3 examples of extreme polarization: money, technology, and institutional change. How do we reach out to moderate voters that used to vote for the candidate and not the party? Well, you got to do something about the money, and you got to do something about the technology, and you got to do something about the institutional structure. Let's start with the technology first. Twitter booted Donald Trump. Okay. That has been talked about an enormous amount. And people are talking about censorship and they're talking about all sorts of other things. But look at what that means. By taking Donald Trump off Twitter, Twitter robbed millions of people of one of their primary sources of political information. I am not comfortable with a society where, a couple of huge tech giants pretty much control the flow of information. However, to the extent that we do live in such a world, it suggests a fairly straightforward answer. Get your friends off Twitter.
But they just go somewhere else. I mean,
Then get them off that.
How are you going to do that? They're so addicted. It's addictive.
Well, there you go. I mean, I don't have a good solution, but I mean, Twitter kicking off Donald Trump, it's not a very good solution, but it does suggest an actual solution. You want people to vote for candidates and not parties. Take away one of the tools that feeds them polarizing information about the parties. Take away Fox News. Now, you can't do that because of the First Amendment. Well, I don't know. Maybe start a revolution in your family and just tell people that they can't be on their phones that much. Next time you're at a family reunion or getting together with a group of friends, just say, hey, by the way, we're going to do this without phones, or challenge people to, find information about a candidate from newspapers. as opposed to memes. I don't know. I mean,
That's
I
a tall
don't.
order.
I'm kind of making light of this because but I do this because I recognize the extent of the problem. Okay, we have become a very polarized nation for really deeply structural reasons that are connected to ways that information is delivered, ways in which politics is funded, and it's going to be very, very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. I frankly have become over the years less and less confident that you're ever going to be able to find ways to do that on the scale on which politics currently operates. I think it's probably more possible on a local level, but even on a local level, a lot of the time you don't have local sources of news any longer. And so, information that would have been the basis of local governance has disappeared, and it's been replaced by, this party-centric line. This is one of the reasons why it's really, really important to actually shell out the money for the Wichita Eagle and the Wichita Business Journal and whatever the newspapers are up there in Hutch. You got to shell out the money for them. You got to support local news, and you got to look for creative ways to keep local news alive, because that at least becomes a source of information that is not part of the national narrative. And that is information with which you might be able to have conversations with people that don't automatically fall into polarized camps.
Would putting the fairness doctrine back in place help?
What's that?
Would putting the fairness doctrine back in place help?
It would help immensely, but how would it be enforced?
That's good.
Because fairness doctrine applied to television networks.
Yeah.
How are we going to apply the fairness doctrine to cable networks? How are we going to apply it to Instagram users? How are we going to apply it to all of the hundreds, the thousands, the tens of thousands of sources of information that the internet has put at our fingertips? I mean, I guess I could imagine some kind of really, really sophisticated algorithm that, by law has to be instituted on all major social media platforms. And what it basically does is it says there has to be X number of, democratic words or democratic websites or democratic postings for the equivalent number of Republican words and Republican websites and Republican postings. But that would result in such a crushing amount of power being invested in this censorious body. Like, I'm gonna go get on my computer and I'm gonna post my comment, but Google flashes me a message. Oh, I'm sorry, the quota of Republican commentary has been taken up today. The fairness doctrine says try again tomorrow.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Along those same lines, I think one of the biggest problems too is we're not enforcing fact-telling anymore. The major networks try to do that. And I'm kind of grateful that Twitter made the decision that they did. And even our local papers, at least our Hutch News, made an inaccurate representation about my campaign finance report in this last election, but at least they were local enough that I got them to rescind the mistake and admit the mistake in the paper 2 days later. Unfortunately, it was November 3rd. No, November 5th. No, November 3rd, election morning. Before the correction was printed in the paper. That I did get my campaign finance report turned in on time.
That's horribly.
That's what happened to me.
So I think that this is
but facts. But at least they
facts.
Twitter and the big social even the networks make me so mad, because it wasn't until recently, when the lies got so dangerous, that now they're finally starting to say, this is not a fact. Here is the fact. They've been kind of brought along with all this ridiculous lie telling as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just venting.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, my wife and I actually met when we were both working for our college newspaper, and I've worked for a couple of newspapers. Journalism, my wife's degree was in journalism. Journalism is in our blood. And I have a lot of respect for journalists, and I have a certain amount of sympathy too. I'm not going to say that you're wrong and that they weren't carried along by this flow. They absolutely were. And let's be honest, since the overwhelming majority of people that go into journalism in the United States of America tend to vote Democratic rather than vote Republican, it's very easy for that same kind of polarization that I talked about to inhabit newsrooms and shape reactions. All of that being said, I am actually very curious and a little bit hopeful that over the last year, you're seeing genuine steps, stumbling steps, certainly, but nonetheless, genuine steps to creating the sort of rules that will allow the newspapers and allow the news networks and allow, the major news websites to call out lies and call out false information. I personally think Twitter banning Donald Trump is defensible, kind of on social, kind of on national security grounds. But it's a very dangerous precedent. I do, however, think that the banning of Donald Trump can be made part of an emerging conversation involving these big tech giants and the ways in which going forward, we have to find some kind of consensus on not identifying what's bullshit and not. I mean, by and large, everybody always knew that, okay? They either chose to ignore it, or they went into a QAnon rabbit hole and actually believed it, or like the majority of the rest of us, we just rolled our eyes and said, well, that's Trump being Trump. I think we're coming to a consensus, or I'm hopeful at least, that we are stumbling towards a consensus regarding how to deal with BS, how to deal with lies. The classic model of, the objective media, the Walter Cronkites, the world, that doesn't work anymore because media doesn't carry that kind of weight. It doesn't have that kind of respect. And you could come up with all sorts of cultural reasons why the media has lost respect, but probably one of the primary reasons why they've lost respect is because there's just so much of it now. There's a million other places you can go besides Walter Cronkite. So the media can't count on people respecting them enough not to lie to them. They are going to have to figure out ways to call out lies and shut up the liars. I want to be hopeful, and I think that I am kind of hopeful that we're too late now, but still that we are kind of stumbling in the direction of that you're going to see going forward newspapers and television news stations and major news websites being much more willing to simply say, candidate X said something that was untrue. And by the same token, if they're going to get into that business, then they have to be a lot more transparent. They have to be a lot more willing to respond to people like yourself who call them and say, you had wrong information there. They need to be able to change that quickly. I actually, again, feel like that is a norm that has been or is being much more internalized by the major news media. I see in news stories all the time very, very clear, announcements that, there was a mistake in an earlier version of this article. We had said this, but we were wrong about that. I'm seeing that in major publications more and more. It's not perfect, obviously, but hopefully it's one of the few things that we can be a little bit optimistic about, or at least I hope so.
Okay, well, I'll talk to you later.
Somebody say something?
Oh, that was a call from my granddaughter who's working for the State House. They have canceled work for her tomorrow and the next day.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're expecting problems.
I know that there had been talk of a big rally at the State House on Saturday that didn't happen, though there were huge rallies in Austin, Texas, and Richmond, Virginia, a couple of other places. I didn't hear that any of them had turned violent, so
yeah.
I don't know.
I would like to recommend, if you guys have Netflix, that you watch a show called Social Dilemma, which is about...
Yeah, you wrote me about that. I've had other people recommend that to me.
Yeah, it's pretty frightening, and we're so far down the line. I don't know how they're going to turn it back. And the thing about this particular show is that it's hosted. Well, I guess host is the right word. The people who speak were internet employees who helped devise the system, and they are all just appalled by what they invented and how dangerous it is and how far along. They give us 20 years, and then pretty soon it's just, there's no turning back.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very, it's a very frightening show.
I'll have to watch it.
Yeah.
It's almost 7:45 and I'm going to have to leave soon. Does anybody else have maybe a final question before I go, or have I run through them all?
Your kids, how have reacted, your students?
What's that?
How have your students reacted?
To which? To what?
Oh, the last 2 months.
I have been gratified leading up to the election. I mean, Friends University is a small campus. It's a pretty homogenous campus, and not a particularly politically active one. But I mean, I was aware of students that were really on the Trump train, that were talking about we're facing the danger of a communist takeover. These were people that were getting all of the misinformation and all of the paranoia from online. And I have not heard anything comparable in in leading up to the inauguration. That's not to say that it's not out there. I mean, we've only had 1 week of classes, but I just I am thinking that maybe this concern, which is a real one, and I know people at different colleges that are very, very worried about things, but I'm thinking that maybe this particular concern hasn't penetrated our student body all that much. I am giving a presentation tomorrow about what happened Tuesday before last and why that makes people frightened for what may happen on Wednesday. And I think our president might be releasing a letter that strongly condemns anybody that might think that this is a moment of revolution. We'll see if that actually happens. For my classes last week, I found by and large the students I think on the sensible side of things. There were some that looked at the attack on the Capitol and said, "Yeah, this is just a bunch of lunatics." And then there were other people that looked at the attack on the Capitol and said, "Oh my word, that's super scary." I had a couple of people that were like, they're like anarchists that want to burn everything down. They're like, they didn't do nearly enough damage. But I have not heard from any of them, and I have not heard from any faculty any examples of any other students who were like, oh yeah, I wish I could have been there. You know, I wish I could have rushed.
That's good.
I hope that's the case.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a delight. I always enjoy speaking to groups like this. As I said, I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. I hope everybody stays healthy and safe. And thank you for inviting me. I look forward to, maybe returning and giving another presentation sometime. Who knows? Maybe in the future, we might even be able to meet face to face, some kind of weird science fiction, utopian, futurist possibility, face-to-face communication, imagine.
Well, we
Dr.
thank
Fox,
you.
thank you.
We thank you
All right.
so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Have a good evening, everybody.